Think about the last time someone in your life did something that genuinely didn't make sense to you. Maybe they quit a stable job to write every morning before sunrise. Maybe they turned down invitations for months straight, not just occasionally, but consistently, predictably, almost defiantly. Maybe they started keeping strange notebooks filled with things nobody else was supposed to read, or going on long walks alone at odd hours, or obsessively rearranging their entire schedule around one single thing that nobody else seemed to take seriously. And you thought, quietly, maybe not even consciously, something's off with them. Here's what nobody tells you. That reaction, that quiet discomfort you felt watching them, is one of the most psychologically revealing moments a human being can have. Because what you were actually witnessing wasn't disorder. It wasn't self-destruction. It wasn't someone falling apart. It was someone building something so quietly, so unconventionally, that the people around them couldn't yet see the architecture. And what makes this matter in your real life, right now, today, is that you have almost certainly been on both sides of that moment. Either you've watched someone and thought they were losing it, or you've been that person and felt the weight of everyone wondering what's wrong with you. And if you've never fully understood why those habits felt so necessary, so non-negotiable, so worth the confusion they caused, what you're about to hear will genuinely change something in how you see yourself. Because here's the thing almost nobody says out loud. The behaviors that get labeled as eccentric, obsessive, antisocial, or just plain weird are often not symptoms of dysfunction at all. They're responses, quiet, adaptive, deeply intelligent responses to a specific kind of mind that processes the world differently and has learned through trial and a lot of painful error what it actually needs to function at its best. Society doesn't always have a vocabulary for this, so instead of understanding it, it labels it, and those labels over time have a real cost. They make people second-guess the very habits that are quietly holding them together. This is about why the habits that look most irrational from the outside are often the ones doing the most serious internal work. There is a pattern that developmental psychologists and cognitive researchers have studied for decades. It doesn't have one clean name, but the consistency across studies is striking. Individuals who eventually produce highly original work in any field, whether it's art, science, business, or athletics, tend to exhibit what researchers call behavioral divergence during their most creative or formative periods. Their daily habits, their rhythms, their social patterns begin to look increasingly unusual compared to the norm. And crucially, this divergence almost always precedes the breakthrough, not follows it. The strange habit comes first. The result that makes it make sense comes later, sometimes years later. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who spent 30 years studying creative individuals across disciplines, found something quietly striking in his research. The people who produced the most original, lasting work were not the ones who followed conventional paths to discipline. They were the ones who had built environments, rituals, and daily structures that looked to an outside observer almost compulsively personal, rigid in ways that made no sense to anyone else, protective in ways that seemed antisocial, private in ways that felt from the outside like withdrawal or even arrogance. And yet, when these individuals were interviewed about their habits, almost none of them could fully explain why the rituals were necessary. They only knew that without them, something essential stopped working. But from the inside, these habits were load-bearing walls. Remove them and something structural collapses. The neuroscience behind this starts not in the brain's creative centers, but in its threat detection systems. The amygdala, which governs the brain's response to perceived danger, is also deeply involved in how we manage environments that either support or disrupt our cognitive function. For minds that operate with high internal complexity, people who process experience deeply, who carry multiple layers of thought simultaneously, who are easily dysregulated by noise, inconsistency, or social unpredictability, the nervous system learns, often from very early in life, to build external order as a counterweight to internal intensity. Research from the field of sensory processing sensitivity, developed by psychologist Elaine Aron, suggests that roughly 15 to 20% of the population processes environmental and emotional data at a significantly deeper level than the average person. For these individuals, the unusual habit isn't a personality quirk. It's a nervous system regulation strategy wearing the costume of an eccentricity. And this starts early. Developmental psychologists have noted that children who grow up in environments that are emotionally unpredictable, not necessarily traumatic, just inconsistent, often develop what looks from the outside like rigidity. They create private systems, rules that make sense only to them, rituals that calm something internal that nobody else can see or measure. By adulthood, these systems have evolved into complex behavioral architectures that the person themselves may not be able to fully articulate. The person who has to write for 2 hours before they speak to anyone isn't being dramatic. They're regulating a nervous system that doesn't transition cleanly between internal and external worlds. The person who takes a long walk alone before any major decision isn't avoiding responsibility. They're processing in the only way their particular neurology actually works efficiently. And the person who needs complete silence before creative work isn't being precious about their comfort. They're managing a brain that genuinely can't filter competing inputs the way other brains can.
None of this is better or worse than any other way of moving through the world. Some people process externally, They talk, collaborate, and think out loud in groups and feel most alive in that movement. Others process so internally that solitude isn't preference, it's function. Neither is correct. They are simply different architectures, shaped by different environments, producing different kinds of output. The problem only arises when one architecture spends its entire life trying to justify itself through the lens of the other. And here is the counterintuitive layer that very few people discuss honestly. These habits, the strange ones, the ones that cost friendships or invite genuine concern, almost never come without a trade. The same intensity that allows a person to go profoundly deep into one thing makes it genuinely difficult to be lightly present in another. The same boundary that protects creative or cognitive function can look from across a dinner table like coldness or indifference. The same capacity to sustain obsessive focus on what matters can make everything outside that focus feel almost impossible to care about. These are not character flaws dressed up as insight. They are real costs, quietly paid, usually in the currency of other people's confusion or quiet disappointment. And most people who carry these habits have also carried for years a private grief about what those habits have cost them in connection and belonging. What this means practically is something important. The habit that looks crazy is usually protecting something real. And the moment someone abandons that habit under social pressure to seem more available, more normal, more like everyone around them, is often the exact moment they lose access to the very thing that made them capable of producing something worth noticing. Howard Hughes looked unhinged. Nikola Tesla's routines were considered bizarre by everyone around him. Maya Angelou went to a hotel room to write in and kept it empty of everything except a Bible and a deck of cards. Not because she was performing isolation, but because her mind needed a specific container to function at the level she was aiming for. The habit protected the work. The work justified nothing. It simply emerged from conditions that were built, deliberately and quietly, against a great deal of social resistance. But here is where genuine honesty matters. Not every strange habit is wisdom wearing a disguise. Some patterns that feel protective are actually avoidance wearing a different name. A nervous system adaptation that once served a real purpose can become a cage over time, quietly, gradually, without the person inside it ever noticing the door closed. And that slow narrowing of a life organized entirely around protection from discomfort, rather than the creation of capacity, is worth paying careful attention to, because these two things can look almost identical from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, until you start asking a different kind of question. So here is something concrete. If any part of this resonated, if you have a habit you've always defended but never fully understood, try this one shift for a single week. Don't justify it to anyone. Don't explain it, don't apologize for it, and don't perform it for anyone else's benefit either. Just do it, privately, and pay close attention to what it produces, not in terms of output or visible results, but in terms of what it does to your internal state before and after. If the habit is genuinely regulatory, you will feel a measurable difference in your clarity, your patience, your access to whatever matters most to you. If it's avoidance, you'll notice something else underneath it, a tightening, a sense of time passing without real movement, a quiet shame that the habit never quite resolves. That distinction between regulation and avoidance is one of the most honest self-assessments you can make. It doesn't require a framework or a professional to name it. It just requires you to stop explaining yourself long enough to actually listen to what's there. The habits that eventually change everything rarely announce themselves clearly. They arrive awkward and inconvenient. They invite concern from people who genuinely care about you. They exist years, sometimes a decade, before anyone else can see what they're building toward. And the people who keep them anyway, not out of stubbornness, not to be difficult, but out of some deep and almost wordless sense that something essential depends on their continuation, those are the people who eventually produce the kind of work, and quietly, the kind of life, that looks from the outside like it came from nowhere. It didn't come from nowhere. It came from the quiet, unglamorous daily maintenance of something that most people gave up on the first time it started to look a little strange. If something landed differently than you expected here, there's a reason for that. The same mind that recognized itself in this is the mind we'll be looking at next, specifically what it tends to do when the pressure to perform finally stops, and what it builds in that silence.